113 years after the sinking, one question still unsettles researchers, divers, and anyone who looks at the Titanic closely. Among passageways, cabins, and sections twisted by time, there is one stateroom still surrounded by silence, missing pieces, and impossible access. We are not talking about a ready-made legend, but an anomaly that still lingers between incomplete records, collapsed structure, and real uncertainty. And when an ordinary door stays closed for that long, the question starts to carry a very different weight.
Today, we're going inside the Titanic and getting close to a cabin that should never be opened.
Almost everyone thinks they already know the Titanic. The image that stayed with the world was that of a massive, luxurious, brightly lit ship, treated as the ultimate symbol of technical confidence at the start of the 20th century. But that popular memory usually stops at the surface. Behind the famous rooms and the flawless appearance, there was an interior far more complex, organized by class, function, and controlled access. And that is exactly where this mystery begins to gain momentum, because some spaces stand out not because of excess, but because of the silence left around them. Inside, the Titanic worked like a floating city, but nothing on board was simple or random. Every corridor had a purpose, every staircase served a specific flow of movement, and every door separated far more than rooms. It separated routine, privilege, service, and limits. That completely changes the way we look at any cabin on the ship. A room was never just a room. Depending on its position and the context around it, it could reveal more about the Titanic's internal logic than most people realize. And that is how a seemingly ordinary space begins to feel strange. The contrast between luxury and backstage reality was enormous. In one part of the ship, everything projected comfort, order, and elegance. In another, there was heat, cold, maintenance, mechanical noise, and hard labor happening non-stop. The Titanic sold a refined image, but it was sustained by something much harsher behind that facade. And it is in that collision between appearance and operation that certain spaces begin to feel unsettling. Because some areas may have looked like ordinary cabins, but they sat far too close to practical routes or support zones to be read that simply. When you try to reconstruct the Titanic's interior with real precision, some sections are well documented, while others drift into a kind of gray zone. This is not about inventing a secret map, and it is not about turning archival gaps into cheap fantasy. What exists are plans that are hard to interpret, incomplete records, internal rearrangements, fragmented memory, and the obvious weight of the disaster hanging over all of it. And let me tell you, sometimes what intrigues us most is not the dramatic information, but the information that is missing. Silence shapes suspicion too. When an area does not fit neatly into later readings of the ship, it starts to stand out by contrast. And that is how this supposed stateroom began to be seen less as a room and more as an unresolved piece inside the puzzle. Among those poorly lit zones in the documentation, the stateroom at the heart of this video begins to emerge. And it matters to stay grounded here, not as some officially cursed room and not as a supernatural reveal, but as a documentary and structural anomaly. A space that, because of its location, later interpretation, and difficulty of access, does not seem to fit perfectly into the ship's simplified narrative. That alone is enough to make it important. Because when an area looks ordinary on the outside, but strange within the larger whole, it begins to collect bigger questions than its appearance would suggest. The discomfort does not come from an invented secret. It comes from the possibility that an ordinary space was pushed outside the full understanding we thought we had of the Titanic. What is most curious is that, in popular memory, this space is not clearly tied to any simple, well-defined routine. That opens possibilities, but none of them should be treated as final truth. It may have been a prepared cabin that saw little use. It may have served as temporary support space. It may have sat in a stretch of the ship where function and accommodation overlapped in a more confusing way than we imagine today. And that matters a great deal, because when the function of a space cannot be read with confidence, every nearby detail starts carrying too much weight. The stateroom stops being just another room and becomes a point of tension between hypothesis, structure, and documentary absence. So what could have been inside if we keep both feet on the ground? No fantasy. No rushed conspiracy. The most plausible scenario would be normal traces of an interrupted routine. Pieces of furniture, metal, wood, fabric, luggage, personal items, and maybe a spatial arrangement that could help clarify the room's real function. And look how powerful that is. Nothing spectacular needs to be there for it to be historically massive. An ordinary room, preserved or partially sealed, could reveal more about circulation, use, and life on board than some wild theory ever could. The mystery is not necessarily in what that space holds, but in why it has remained closed for so long. The night of the disaster begins almost without asking permission. The sea was relatively calm, the cold was bitter, visibility was deceptive, and high above, the lookouts were trying to read the horizon with the naked eye, without binoculars. Down below, the ship kept moving through its routine with the confidence of something still believed to be fully under control. And that is what gets under your skin. For a few minutes, the Titanic still seemed completely normal. The lounges were operating, the corridors were calm, service was flowing, the lights were on, the structure still felt firm, but the problem was already waiting in the meeting point between speed, ice, and delayed perception. Sometimes disaster begins like that, with no moral siren, no dramatic warning, just waiting for the second it stops being avoidable. When the ice finally enters the field of view, response time is almost nothing, and the margin for error practically vanishes. But the impact does not happen the way so many popular dramatizations still insist on showing it. It is not a clean, cinematic, head-on collision. It is a side scrape, lower, longer, and far more treacherous, running along the submerged section of the hull. To many people on board, it may even have felt smaller than it really was. And that is the fatal point. The damage does not announce itself with a visible spectacle for everyone to see. It starts doing its work where almost no one can see it, below the waterline, spreading a loss the ship would not be able to overcome for very long. What is most deceptive in that moment is the false sense that maybe it was not all that serious. In many parts of the ship, the collision feels like nothing more than a strange vibration, a brief shudder, something uncomfortable, but still manageable. And honestly, that is where the cruelty of this story lives. Because the most devastating historical error does not always arrive making noise. Sometimes it slips in quietly, almost politely, as if it does not deserve your full attention. Notice how the details change everything when we return to the facts honestly. So let this sink in. On the Titanic, what looked small above the surface was already becoming irreversible below it, without waiting for anyone to understand in time. After the scrape, the ship begins to change from the inside, and not in a spectacular way, but in the most dangerous way possible. Compartment by compartment, calculation by calculation, door by door. Water enters the forward sections, the logic of the watertight compartments kicks in, and the technical crew tries to buy time inside a problem that was already too large the moment it began. The strange, and at the same time terrible, reality is that the Titanic starts existing in two different rhythms. Above, there is still doubt, interpretation, hesitation. Below, there is already physical certainty. And when disaster splits itself like that, the entire interior changes meaning. Corridors stop being neutral passageways. Cabins stop being stable shelter. And that sealed stateroom begins to weigh even more heavily as a symbol of lost access. From that point on, the corridors stop being just corridors. Some still guide people with relative normalcy. Others start forcing everything backward, limiting movement, creating hesitation, and changing the body's sense of space. Have you ever felt how a familiar place can become something else entirely when it loses its stability? On the Titanic, the architecture begins to work against the people still trying to trust it. What once organized now obstructs. What once guided now disorients, and that applies to the common spaces and to the ambiguous ones. The more the ship tilts, the more every room and cabin begins to exist inside a new logic. The logic of urgency, restriction, and growing impossibility. It is here, right in the middle of the story, that the stateroom reaches its greatest force. Not because someone opens the door and finds something sensational, but because it starts condensing everything the Titanic is becoming that night. A room that looks ordinary on the outside, but is trapped between documentary uncertainty, increasing list, altered routes, pressure of time, and loss of access. There is something chilling about thinking about it the right way. Not because of fantasy, but because of how real it is. The room stops being just an interesting hypothesis and becomes the perfect image of what the entire ship is producing. Regions where routine was interrupted before it could ever be fully understood. And at that point, the mystery no longer depends on dramatic proof. It carries weight because the historical context itself makes it breathe. After that, the question changes shape. It is no longer only about what was inside. The question becomes whether that space could still have been reached in any real way that night. As the tilt increases, the interiors shift off axis, and certain passageways stop functioning the way they once did. The stateroom begins to be sealed off by the ship's own behavior. Not by some theatrical scene, not by a written order everyone knows about. But by gravity, by deformation, by urgency. and by the simple fact that the Titanic was no longer offering the same internal map to anyone trying to move through it. If the room was strange before, it now exists inside an even harsher reality, the reality of true inaccessibility. The bow's descent makes visible what could still be denied before. The ship begins to point toward the sea in a way that becomes more and more obvious. The interiors respond, objects answer to the angle, and movement through the ship stops being a comfortable choice. The Titanic is no longer just in trouble. It is violently reorganizing every space that once felt safe, and that matters deeply to the story we are telling here. Because the stateroom, which began as a documentary anomaly, now enters the story as a place the disaster itself begins to seal shut. Ahead, the ocean rises. Inside, the ship changes. And somewhere between those two forces, certain rooms permanently leave the world of direct observation. The Titanic's final collapse does not need to be shown as spectacle to be devastating. All you have to do is look at the physical logic of what was happening. The bow had already dragged the ship too far down, the structure was working under impossible stress, and the rest of the vessel was responding to loads. A liner of that size was never built to carry at that angle. What happens there is less an exaggerated movie image and more an extreme material failure, and that detail changes everything. Because the moment the ship stops holding together as a unit, any remaining interior stops existing as an accessible place and begins to belong to a structural violence that tears, shifts, compresses, and erases roots all at once. After the surface, the story changes elements. The Titanic disappears from the normal human world and enters the territory of falling into darkness. It is a hard cut, almost brutal, because the ship that had once ruled the Atlantic with light, form, and status is now descending without a horizon, surrounded by bubbles, debris, metal mass, and deepening blackness. The feeling changes completely. This is no longer about evacuation, decks, or cabins. It is about depth, pressure, and total loss of reference. And that gives our mystery another layer, because the stateroom, which had already become inaccessible within the logic of the disaster, now belongs to the world of the abyss, where every space is rewritten by water, by descent, and by the impact still waiting below. On the ocean floor, the Titanic stops being a ship and becomes a ruin. The impact against the seabed is not symbolic, poetic, or clean. It is a violent meeting between mass, speed, deformation, and sediment. The bottom receives what remains. The structure scatters fragments. The debris field arranges itself through the force of collapse, and what was once architecture on board becomes scattered archaeology. From here on, understanding the Titanic no longer means thinking only about the night of the sinking. It means accepting that the story broke apart into pieces, distances, and silences. And inside that brutal transformation, the sealed stateroom stops being just an onboard hypothesis and becomes an archaeological possibility surrounded by destruction. The decades pass and the world above changes completely. Wars, technologies, new ships, new images, new obsessions. But the Titanic remains down there, motionless, far from the light, moving through time in a way that almost feels unbelievable. That deeply affects the power of this subject, because while the surface forgets, romanticizes, and simplifies, the deep sea preserves, corrodes, and complicates. The ship does not disappear from the collective imagination. Quite the opposite. It grows into a symbol, but the bigger the myth becomes, the more some of its real spaces become unreachable. That stateroom survives exactly in that collision between public memory and material limit. And honestly, that is where the mystery becomes more serious, because it stops being curiosity and becomes a confrontation between what we remember and what we can actually touch. When modern expeditions finally manage to reach the Titanic, something important shifts. The wonder is no longer only in locating the ship, but in realizing that finding it does not mean fully understanding it. The first images reveal its scale, its position on the seafloor, the corrosion, the debris field, and the violence of what time has done to the structure. But a camera, no matter how good it is, does not create access where the ship no longer allows access. And that is decisive for our subject. Seeing the Titanic is not the same as entering the Titanic. Mapping is not the same as reaching, and some areas remain on the far side of that line, visible enough to disturb us, inaccessible enough to stay silent. Technically, pushing into certain areas of the Titanic is a dangerous game. Visibility can vanish with the slightest movement of water, the structure can give way, corroded plates can collapse, and what looks stable from the outside may be empty within. The deep ocean punishes overconfidence, and that is even more true for internal passageways, collapsed doors, and compartments compressed over more than a century. You look at it and think, all you need to do is get a little closer, but it is not that simple. That exact way of thinking destroys evidence, stirs up sediment, and wipes away historical reading in seconds. In many cases, the limit is not the will to discover. It is the responsibility not to ruin what still remains. There is also a barrier deeper than technique: ethics. The Titanic is not just an extraordinary historical structure, it is also a maritime grave. And that changes the conversation in a radical way. It is not enough to ask whether we can enter, whether we can open, whether we can get better footage. The serious question is different. How far should we go? Because a closed space on the ocean floor is not just an exploration challenge. It may also be a boundary of respect, and that idea weighs heavily in the case of this stateroom. The fact that it remains sealed or inaccessible does not automatically mean a lack of scientific courage. It may mean maturity, restraint, and a clear understanding of what is at stake. From a purely documentary point of view, what might a sealed stateroom like this still hold today? The most plausible scenario is far less fantastical and, precisely for that reason, far more powerful. Remains of furniture, metal fittings, wood, fabric, personal objects, fragments of an internal arrangement that might better clarify the purpose of that space. And notice how powerful that is. A place that looks ordinary could hold precious information about use, routine, circulation, and even how the ship was occupied in its final days. Nothing extraordinary has to be there for the result to be historically enormous. Sometimes the greatest impact is not found in the improbable, it is found in the ordinary, preserved against all odds. There is also a very real chance that the full answer will never appear. And not because someone is hiding some cinematic secret, but because the wreck itself may have made that space permanently unreadable. Structural collapse, sediment blockage, corrosion, internal compression, loss of spatial reference. All of it scrambles what may once have been a simple room, and that possibility has to be accepted with maturity. Not every historical question gets a final, beautiful, complete image. Some stop at the line between what survived and what can no longer be safely reconstructed. Maybe the true weight of this stateroom lies exactly there. It remains important even without giving us a definitive answer. The stateroom becomes a kind of frontier. On one side, legitimate curiosity. On the other, the recognition that there are places where history still asks for distance. And maybe that tension is exactly what keeps this subject alive. The Titanic sank in 1912, but some of its questions are still not over. That sealed stateroom may never give the public everything it wants to see, and maybe that is exactly what keeps its power alive even now. The ship became a symbol of excess, failure, memory, and absence. But beneath every famous image, there are still zones of silence resisting time, the camera, and our hunger for quick answers.
This video was a historical reconstruction created with AI based on period records for educational and narrative purposes.
And that is deeply human, isn't it? We want to open, explain, conclude. But some historical mysteries remain standing because the reality around them is harsher than any perfect script. On the Titanic, even a closed door can still tell an entire story.